Welcome back, everyone, to Pontos Fathom Press. This is our Pontos Fathom podcast, episode 89. Today we're going to be jumping into all things Neptune, especially, though, in relation to this concept of the Dreamlands. We're going to use Lovecraft's Dreamlands and actually the Volume 5 of our Alchemical Courtship in the Dreamlands, Volume 5, Regret, Redemption, Resurrection, and talking about Atlantis, ocean depths, the unconscious, the idea of redemption. You see, we have redemption in both of these titles, but also what are those formations of the unconscious, and that linkage between these water myths, these sinking and rising myths, and also the idea of dreams, and how, one of our ongoing themes is the Lovecraftian intuition around the Dreamlands, and then the projection of this. I want to kind of start with a quote out of Lovecraft itself and talk a bit about Cthulhu, who kind of is the Atlantean horror version of the Atlantis myth, right? Sunken Regna, we have the city that sinks below the ocean, and we've got this fallen star god, Cthulhu, right? And this is from Call of Cthulhu, and we have as a first quote here, above these apparent, the bas-relief was a rough rectangle, less than an inch thick and about 5 by 6 inches in area, obviously of modern origin. Its designs, however, were far from modern in atmosphere and suggestion. For although the vagaries of cubism and futurism are many and wild, they do not often reproduce the cryptic regularity which lurks in prehistoric writing. In writing of some kind, the bulk of these designs seems certainly to be, though my memory, despite my familiarity with the papers and collections of my uncle, failed in any way to identify this particular species. Above the apparent hieroglyphics was a figure of evidently pictorial intent, though its impressionistic execution forbade a very clear idea of its nature. It seemed to be sort of a monster, or symbol representing a monster, or a form which only a diseased fancy could conceive. If I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneously pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. A pulpy tentacled head surmounting a grotesque body and scaly rudimentary wings. The general outline of the whole made it most shockingly frightful. The figure was a vague suggestion of a cyclopean architectural background. The writing accompanying this oddity, aside from the stack of press cuttings, is Professor Angel's most recent hand, made no pretense at literary style. What seemed to be the main document was headed Cthulhu Cult, in characters painstakingly printed. The manuscript was divided in 2 sections, the first of which was headed 1925, Dream and Dream Work of A.H.A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas Street, Providence, Rhode Island, and the second, The Narrative of Inspector John R. Legrasse, 121 Benville, St. New Orleans, Louisiana, 1908. The other manuscript papers are all brief, some of them accounts of the queer dreams of different persons, some of them citations from theosophical books and magazines, notably W. Scott Eliot's Atlantis and Lost Lemuria, and Miss Murray's Witch Cults of Western Europe, and Fraser's Golden Bough. He goes on to say that Professor Angel lived there in Providence at the Fleur-de-Lis building. Actually, it's a real place near the Rhode Island School of Design. Actually, I lived in Providence for a little while. In that area, I took a blacksmith class over at the Rhode Island School of Design. It was very good. Angel called himself hypersensitive, and instead folks of the ancient commercial city dismissed him as widely strange. Even the Providence Art Club, anxious to preserve his conservation, found him quite hopeless. They pronounced the letters at the bottom of this bas-relief as Cthulhu Fatagan, right? And we will get to those theosophical books, but I wanted to just take you to this one other passage. It says, the data received in suspense and astonishment by the assembled members proved doubly exciting to Inspector Legrasse. There had been both detective and scientist agreed on the virtual identity of the phrase common to 2 hellish rituals in so many worlds of distance apart. What in substance both the Esquimau wizards and Louisiana swamp priests have chanted in their kindred idols with something like this, the word divisions being guessed at from traditional breaks in the phrase Tsungului Nglafin Cthulhu Regna Wagen Fatagen. In his house at Regna, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Okay, so we've got the initial inspection, let's call it, of an Atlantean kind of play at work. Atlantis sinking, one of the primordial myths, an unconscious thought maybe, because imagining the idea of somehow a star-fallen, alien, eldritch, ancient one has fallen under the ocean. But it has a strange resonance with the idea of sinking Atlantis. And I'll just call out quickly this Isis Unveiled. We've got Isis Unveiled here. And we did have the mention of the Dreamlands, but I wanted to just call out, as Lovecraft points to Atlantis, let's take a little look at Atlantis. It says, here, the perfect identity of the rites, ceremonies, traditions, and even the names of the deities among Mexicans and Babylonians and Egyptians are sufficient proof of South America being peopled by a colony which mysteriously found its way across the Atlantic. When and at what period? History is silent at this point. But those who consider that there is no tradition, sanctified by ages, without a certain sediment of truth at the bottom of it, believe in the Atlantis legend. There are, scattered throughout the world, a handful of thoughtful and solitary students who pass their lives in obscurity, far from the rumors of the world, studying the great problems of the physical and spiritual universe. They have their secret records, which are preserved in the fruits of the scholastic labors of the long line of recluses whose successors they are. The knowledge of the early ancestors, the sages of India, Babylonia, and the imperial Thebes, the legends and traditions commented upon by the masters of Solon, Pythagoras, and Plato. In the marble halls of Heliopolis and Sais, traditions which in their days already seemed hardly glimmer from behind the foggy curtain of the past, all this and much more is recorded on indestructible parchment and passed with jealous care from one adept to another. These men believed the story of Atlantis to be no fable, but maintained that at different epochs of the past, huge islands and even continents existed where they now is but a wild waste of water. In those submerged temples and libraries, the archaeologists would find, but he could explore them, the materials fulfilling all the gaps which now exist in what we imagine is history. Okay, so what are we saying here? All history could be answered were we to know a greater history of what has sunken beneath the waves. What was interesting to me is, like, we have an image here too of, is this a city rising or is it a city sinking? Is it a city rising from out of the water? You know, in Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu, the adventurers go off to a point in the Pacific and they do witness the rise of Regna. But Atlantis risen is another kind of trope that we hear a lot in sort of mystery school talk and things like this about the rising of Atlantis. Is sort of like the Luciferian aspects of the Theosophical societies and perhaps even in the anthroposophical traditions where, you know, Lucifer rising was also this kind of concept of maybe the Age of Enlightenment, something like this. Let's just go on to one more passage from Blavatsky here. It says, there were no communications with the fair island by sea, but subterranean passages known only to the chiefs, communicated with at all directions. Traditional points to many of the majestic ruins of India, Elephantia, and the caverns of Ajunta, which belonged once to colleagues which are now such subterranean ways. Who can tell but the lost Atlantis, which is also mentioned in the secret book, but again under another name, pronounced in the sacred language, did not exist in those days. The great lost continent might have perhaps been situated south of Asia, extending from India to Tasmania. If the hypothesis now is so much doubted and positively denied by some learned authors who regard it as a joke of Plato's. They may even perceive that Plato's guarded hints, the fact that he's attributing the narrative to Solon, the Egyptian priest, were but a prudent way of imparting the fact to the world, and by cleverly combining truths and fiction to disconnect him from a story which the obligation imposed at initiation forbade him to divulge. And how could not the name of Atlanta itself originate with Plato all along? Atlante is not a Greek name. It is a construction that has nothing to do with Grecian elements to it. The words Atlas and Atlantic have no satisfactory etymology in any known language in Europe. They are not Greek, and cannot be referred to any known language of the Old World. But in the Nahuatl or Toltec language, we find immediately the radical atl, like axolotl in the Dune saga, right? The axolotl, which signifies water, war, and the top of the head. It's Atlantic. We have the Atlantica, to combat. A city named Atlan existed in a continent discovered by Columbus in the entrance to the Gulf of Uhara in the Darien. The Pueblo village named Aklo. So there's almost an American kind of vibe to it, right? Because you have Americo Vespucci, Albertius, Ike, Karai, Kaikai. Yes, he omits the names of these travels. So we have the Atlan. Abbé de Bourbourg's theory of Atlan is the source of Atlas and Atlantic. As Plato was not the only writer who treated of a world beyond the Pillars of Hercules. And as the ocean still shallow and grows seaweeds all through the tropical part of the Atlantic, it is not wild to imagine this continent projected. We know that Lemuria in the Indian Ocean is a dream of scientists, and that the Sahara and the middle belt of Asia were perhaps once seabeds. So we go into a little bit more about the lost Atlantis and the Popol Vuh, the Force Race, and Atlantean Noah. So lots of things about Atlantis that we could go into. But I just wanted to sort of bring it up to say, what does this have to do with the dreams and the unconscious? Well, for something we forget, right? The forgotten dream, the forgotten truth. It's also something that has to do with the unconscious itself, right? So we've talked here many times on the idea that the fiction writer, perhaps in imagination, is exhibiting some type of remote viewing. I think we talked about it. We had a podcast a while ago about Conan and the Hyborian Age, and Robert E. Howard talking about Atlantis and sort of theosophical themes. The idea is he was just making up a world building for his fictions, and yet it talks about fallen Atlantis, and Kull comes from Atlantis, and then there's the Hyborian Age, the Hyperboreans, the Sumerians. All of these kind of ancient histories show that the world is much older than our history does. And as we lean into this fiction, we start to find that, oh, there are things like this. And that's why people often ask me on the channel, why are we bringing Lovecraft's Dreamlands into it? Why are we bringing Lovecraft into something that's potentially metaphysical? Because I think that in a weird fear-based way, we can learn a lot from Lovecraft's nightmares, in the sense of what is a possible pathway to other ways of thinking about the history problem. So let's take a moment now to build up what the Dreamlands could be. Right, the name of the saga here on the table is The Alchemical Courtship in the Dreamlands. And in Volume 5 now, we've already got podcasts on Aim Aimless, Aim Vicious, which is Volume 1, Hope's Home, Hysteria's Heart, Stubborn Devotions, Inventing and Forgiving, and Beloved, Believe, Bedaled are the first 4 volumes. And what we start to see unfolding in the saga is the notion that the Dreamlands are quite an interesting place, to say the least. The Dreamlands start out as, let's just think of our dreams that we have. We have some mundane dreams. We think about going to school and we have an exam that day. We're wearing pajamas at the grocery store or something, or even fears. We have frightful dreams. And all of these kind of vestibules of the Dreamlands, they speak more to reflections on our daily life in the waking. But if we start to look at the broader potential, what would Borges do with a map of the Dreamlands, or what did Lovecraft do with a map of the Dreamlands? And as we start to explore that map, and as the saga explores the map, we start to see there's people like King Kuranes in Lovecraft's lore, who was the king of the capital city of the realms of the Dreamlands, Celiphaeus. And there's also the Dalathlene, and in the saga we call it the Iron Dome Dalathlene. And it's where the archive is. It's where Saturn himself was chained beneath in Tartarus in the adamantine chains from Zeus himself. And suddenly the gods show up in the Dreamlands. Why? Well, isn't worship of the gods something like a dream, right? Aren't we projecting as dreamers the hopes and fears of those gods? And then what's the fate of the forgotten gods, right? What happens to the gods whose worshippers whose idols had been toppled and its worshippers have moved on? What happens to an immortal god in an immortal dreamland? Isn't there room enough in the Dreamlands for all those pathways, we'll call them, all of those deities to suddenly find themselves without worshippers in a new modality? Something about atemporally proximate, right? Lacan talks about linear time and then symbolic time. Wouldn't the Dreamlands somewhat happen in symbolic time? Couldn't you? My friend just had a dream where a television host that we grew up with thanked him in his dream. And he's like, well, he died before when I was young, so how could he be thanking me? But there's sort of a retro causality could be possible in the Dreamlands. Or perhaps historical figures could know each other in the Dreamlands. And I think this is where we find ourselves in Regret, Redemption, and Resurrection, where we have some of these Olympian gods, we have some of these titans, we have some of these artifacts from Lovecraft's Dreamlands coexisting with the dream version of the gods. Well, what would the dream version of Neptune be? Right? What is the dreaming Neptune versus the god Neptune? Are they the same? Does the god dream? These are all fascinating questions that can get explored here. But I think one thing that kind of makes it interesting is there is a bit of the concordance between the unconscious and also this astrological Neptune. And if we flip through the Liz Green's Neptune book, the discovery of the unconscious is part of this dreamy concept. Think of Lovecraft himself as kind of a hysteric. And you've got the Franz Anton mesmerism, the 18th century, where we're starting to have hypnosis and these weird diagnoses of hysteria and these neuroses that were just being discovered, right? And you look at those realms, and the nature of Neptune starts to fall into some of these more modern ways of looking at what used to be the soul. Now we have a psychoanalytic soul. Now we have the psychoanalytic. So Mars is the psychoanalytic, and Mars is the esoteric. Mars is dreamy. Mars is delusional, also artistic. Right? There's a lot of these Mars qualities. I was saying Mars. I meant Neptunian. I kept saying Mars. I don't know why I said Mars. Isn't that interesting? Neptune is artistic, and Neptune is psychological. We have here the political Neptune. I just want to drop right into this. It says, the romantic socialism coincident with Neptune's transit through Aquarius in the 1830s and 1840s was a passionate, compassionate, reformist, and mystical socialism. Ironically, Marx cannot be considered a Neptunian by any stretch of the imagination, although Neptune was conjunct Uranus and square Pluto at the time of his birth. The message of Marx's socialism is revolutionary and violent. Perhaps like Hitler, Marx was the mouthpiece of his own generation, the natal combination of Neptune, conjunct Uranus, and square Pluto. The authors of mundane astrology relate Marx's socialism to the cycle of Saturn and Neptune. The conjunction of these two planets occurs every 36 years. Marx did not have them in aspect. But as we see, a Neptune-Saturn conjunction presides over the writing of the Communist Manifesto. Under the next conjunction in 1882, the Russian Revolution occurred, Stalin died with the following one, and Soviet influence extended into Africa. The Soviet collapse under the most recent conjunction in Capricorn occurred in 1989. The configurations of Saturn and Neptune are celestial markers in this history when efforts are made, sometimes violent and sometimes peaceable, to make Eden incarnate. Wow. Neptune and the artist, Neptune and aspect, right? So I'm going to jump into a bit of this in Regret, Redemption, and Resurrection. I've got a couple of passages I wanted to read from this. This is taking place where what has gone before. So in the realms of the Dreamlands, we have King Kuranis, who is the dreamer of the city of Celiphaeus in the Dreamlands. But there are also, let's say, out of worship gods who are also in attendance. One of those being Saturn and one being Neptune, aforementioned. And we've got this quote from the Codex Atlanticae Relenium. It says, "The void is the shadow of chaos, where silence breathes and echoes carry the weight of forgotten truth. In its expanse lies no form, no end, only eternal hum of what is unspoken and infinite. The void dreams without shape. It whispers, weaving the threads of all that must collapse into the maw of eternity. Within its depths, the rhythm of nothingness pulses, binding what was to what will never be again." And you have this written in the Nagvoidyaga e Fatagin Nawai Naganale Shagvoltanan Yakar Nagalan Krethanan Tharanak Neglui Neglai Shuntlui, something like this, right? The dark curtains pulsed under the formless temple. The void throne thickened as the elder god's presence grew more palpable. Neptune, standing firm before the faceless void throne, felt the oceanic pressure within his chest, tightening like an unseen hand around him. His crown, the symbol of his dominion, glimmered faintly in the dim, ever-shifting light of this deeper realm of Pontos. Each pulse of the water around him seemed to resonate. Neptune's physical sense was the very essence of his awareness, and then without warning, the weight of that silence cracked open, and Neptune's ears reverberated to the core, shaking the foundations of his identity. "Remove your crown before me," he intoned. Though the words were gentle, there's no inevitability with them. The demand was not forceful, but elemental. The crown, which had once seemed the embodiment of Neptune's power and authority, now felt like a fragile construct, a mere ornament, masking the deeper and more ancient truths. So here we see Neptune faced with, who's like Poseidon, faced with the more primordial ocean. So Neptune rules over the ocean in a kind of Olympian context. But if we go deeper into this more ancient context, what is that primordial ocean? Well, it's much like this chain of descent through history, where we find ourselves not only back to Atlantis, but to the very nature of what the history really is behind that. His form grew shiftless, darker, more immense. "You are more than the crown, my nephew," he said, his voice endless as the tide that swept through the temple, erasing the last vestiges of Neptune's hesitation. "What you seek lies beyond the boundaries of power, in the deep, in the place where even time itself crumbles to fragments. The crown has served you well only in the ordered realms, which are the Olympian realms. But here, in the abyss, it will only bind you." The elder god's words were a current and a pull that drew Neptune deeper into the heart of the abyss, into the infinite darkness that stretched beyond the limits of his domain. The waters within the water rippled, as if reality itself recoiled from the sheer weight of the abysmal revelation. He simply was a primordial essence, deep and vast, that the acting felt like the slow, crushing tides of eternity. And as it enveloped Neptune as he turned inward, a spiraling vortex. Neptune was no longer Neptune. He was no longer anything, just a fragment of thought cast adrift in the endless void that coalesced into something tangible. He was standing on the surface of a world, a planet so distant and alien, that its very presence felt like an affront to nature. The name came to him unbidden, as though it had been etched into his mind before the birth of his kind. Vural, the planet of uncountable ages, located in the 23rd nebula, a place where the laws of physics and time itself, long held since decayed into the form of twisted, arcane mathematics. Before him the planet stretched the landscape of bizarre geometries, shifting and folding upon itself that defied understanding. The ground beneath his feet was not solid, but seemed to ripple like water. It was here on this forsaken world that Neptune's mind was forced to witness of the origins of something far older, far darker than he had even imagined. This was Cthulhu, the mathematician of madness, the ascendant mind who had dared to pierce the veil between realities and made contact with the entities, evil, lurking in the farthest reaches of the cosmos. It was through this communion that Cthulhu had become Cthulhu, the harbinger of chaos, this ancient force that would one day bring the stars to ruin. Cthulhu's mind stretched far beyond Vural, reaching to the distant star Zoth, and they spawned his dark offspring, each more terrifying than the last. Neptune could only watch. He saw Cthulhu and his star spawn. And there are times, the elder god said, when oceans give way, and times where it takes back what was lost. Rillier did not simply fall, it sank by design, by the will of forces deeper and more ancient than you can fathom, my nephew. His voice echoed, a ripple through the abysmal dark. In the confusion of that sinking, when the vast city crumbled into the abyss, it was not merely an act of destruction, it was an act of preservation, a veil drawn across time, obscuring what lay beneath. For the fall of Rillier did not merely affect the surface. Its impact tore through to the very fabric of reality, sinking Atlantis and Lemuria into forgotten history. But those are mere shadows of what truly lies below. Neptune's eyes narrowed, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to process the full meaning of his uncle's words. His mind raced back to the lost civilizations of Atlantis and Lemuria. Pontos was suggesting that something far deeper was at play. Lemuria, a place considered far older, far darker, far more dangerous than you could have imagined. Beneath Atlantis lay Lemuria, and beneath Lemuria lay Mu. Beneath the deepest ocean trenches, beyond the light of the stars and the reach of time, there lies something older still. So I think here this is interesting where we can kind of see this nature of how there is kind of a place which is quite unconscious, stream of unconscious, where you can see where all these things kind of have a common origin, right? What is this cascade of sunken cities, right? We have all of these lost continents, all of these sunken cities. So I think there's something here that's very interesting in the sense that we are getting to what is the actions of gods in the Dreamlands, and what do they dream of, and what kind of relations would they have, right? And Neptune stood silent, his breath steadied in the crown, settled once more upon his head, the weight of it, both physical and metaphysical, pressed down upon him. In placing the crown upon him, restored Neptune's status as a ruler of the seas. He restored his place in the cosmic order, aligning once more with the forces that governed both ocean and the stars. The knowledge of what was to come, of Saturn, of Cthulhu, of the ancient slumber beneath the waves, did not dissipate. It remained pulsing at the edge of his consciousness. The time for action is past. Now we must wait. The waters are shifting, the oceans are rising. Soon all will be revealed. So in this kind of plight of the unconscious, we have the father figure. We have that father figure. We have the idea of the lost mysteries. Got the map of the Dreamlands here as well. But if we kind of look at what some of this relates to in the Lacan book, I have a bookmark here about. I did want to talk a little bit about the idea of the father. But I have the bookmark here at the world is preoccupied with symbolism, An article appeared in the International Journal in June 1956 under the title Symbolism and Its Relationship to the Primary and Secondary Processes, which Mr. Charles Rycroft tries to give symbolic meaning to the current state of analysis. Those of you who read English would do well to familiarize yourselves with this matter. You have seen the terms primary and secondary process in the Rycroft articles, but I've never spoken to you about them. The opposite between primary process and secondary process dates from the time, without being completely identical to this, it covers the contrasting notations of pleasure principle and the reality principle. I have alluded to these two terms more than once here. So I'll come to the heart of the matter. When one isolates the notion of pleasure principle as the primary process and once ends up with where Rycroft does, he thinks that he has to define the primary process, set it aside for its structural characteristics, and place in the background condensation, displacement, and so on, everything that Freud began to inquire into, which defined the unconscious, so that he can characterize it in terms of what the final formulation of Freudian theory contributes. Specifically, he turns it to an ordinary original mechanism, whether you understand it as a historical stage or as an underlying ground on the basis of which something else would develop. It would be kind of base or psychical depth, taking it to the logical sense, an obligatory point of departure for reflection in response to impulses from drives. There is supposedly always a tendency in the human subject. It obviously cannot be anything else. The conception of the relationship between the need and satisfaction does exist, and it may effectively be sustainable, at least at one level. It is so profoundly impregnated the whole analytic thought that what has come to the foreground of the primitive or primordial gratifications or satisfactions and frustrations are produced at the beginning of the subject's life. And this is what I would like to point out to you. And I wanted to read also about the obsessional and his desire, just quickly here. It says, some of the unfortunate other confusing outcomes of analysis find their origin in a number of presuppositions concerning what constitutes a good termination of analytic treatment, presuppositions which effect is to exalt the obsessional subject via the perspective of his good intentions, which then become rapidly established and incite him to give himself over to one of the most common of these tendencies, which is expressed more or less as follows: do not do to others what you would not like to be done to yourself. This categorical imperative, structuring in morals, does not always lend itself to practical employment in existence, and it's completely beside the mark within the question of performing something like intercourse. The order of relationship with the other, then, consists in the putting oneself in the place as a tempting slippage, and all the more of the analyst being precisely in the aggressive relationship vis-a-vis the other. His semblable is quite naturally tempted to occupy the position of sparing him, as it were. Sparing the other is what lies at the heart of the entire series of ceremonials. If one's aim is to generalize, what is manifesting itself in his symptoms does not work with reason and doubts, and it's much complicated if the aim is to turn into a moralizing extrapolation and propose to him what one calls the oblative outcome, that is, submission to the other's demands. As the aim and outcome of the problem, well then, this detour is not really worth the effort. From this perspective, it can be said that the paths of the obsessional finds for himself, and down which he seeks the solutions into the problems of desire, are inadequate, and even if they are not adept, because at least the problems can be clearly read in them. Amongst the modes of solution, there are some examples that are located at the level of an effective relationship with the other, the manner in which the obsessional conducts himself with his semblable, when he is still capable of doing so and are not submerged by his symptoms. For example, I have spoken to you about the exploits of obsessionals. What are these exploits? For there to be an exploit, there has to be at least 3 people. And he calls this the other problem. Well, I wanted to share those, and then let's return to the other character that emerges in the saga's Dreamlands, and that is the one of Saturn. So we've seen a little bit of Neptune confronting the primordial ocean. Now we have the Saturnian accord. It says, where there is an abyss, there is no void, and yet they are not the same. Cthulhu exalts himself as kin to Azathoth, for his essence resonates within the infinite chaos. Though the signals of his depth sleep, he corrupts the fragile minds that drift into the dreaming tides of Rillia. The echoes of his being intertwine with the unbound, warping the thoughts into endless spirals of shadow. The cult cant in tongue is born of Yog-Sothoth's design, their words twisting through the fabric of what could never be. Thus the corrupted minds echo the signal, bound eternally to the rhythms of Azathoth's chaotic pulse. But now we're going to see the rising of Saturn to counteract this madness. And I think this is sort of the discipline of Saturn coming to show. With the Saturnum Regna, the city-state hewn from the marrow of reality itself and steeped in the primordial resonance of the cosmic abyss, the air carried an unspoken weight, as though the void beyond time had drawn itself inward to witness this singular convergence. The walls of the great chamber, towering monoliths of void stone, etched with the shifting sigils that pulsed faintly in the imprisoned light of dying stars, seemed to hum with consciousness older than the Dreamlands themselves. The craftsmen who had shaped the Regna when the cosmos was still nascent shifted in hues that defied human perception, casting patterns of shadow and anti-light across the form. And there Saturn sat, the nexus of the space, enthroned in the void throne, his form incomprehensible. Around him, archons, aeons, and archangels moved not as individuals, but as celestial bodies drawn into his orbit, tethered to the inescapable pull of the Titan's looming authority. Saturn has every movement, a study in paradoxical stillness and boundless dynamism, rose from the void throne, his towering form blotting out the faint luminescence of the shifting sigils. Sophia, the first among archons, rose and stood. Cascading spectra of knowledge, her form embodying an eternal grace that had seemed to hold the very essence of understanding within her folds. Her voice, sharp as the cutting edge of divine truth, and imbued with a defiant cadence, filled the chamber as she addressed Saturn. And what is it that you promised, Titan? She intoned. You, who have tasted liberation, now seek to bind us beneath your rule? Shall we exchange one tyrant for another? What guarantee we do have that your grasp will not suffocate the fragile threads of existence as surely as the forces we seek to repel? Behind her, Abraxas, his hybrid form of man, serpent, and rooster, a grotesque amalgamation of dominion, turned his spinning helm of countless unblinking eyes towards Saturn, the relentless gauge and challenging itself. Your reign, Saturn, begins not with conquest, but with chains, he hissed, his voice a chorus of contradictions. And so the aeons and archons sort of court Saturn. And then the archangels court Saturn. And the Queen of Love stepped forward, her grace to defy the weight of the moment. The center of the chamber, her flowing silks shimmering with the iridescence of galaxies, her eyes pools that glimmered. You speak of unity, she said, yet unity without trust is more than a fragile facade, destined to crumble beneath the weight of your own deception. Saturn offers survival, not freedom. But what is freedom if the Dreamlands are reduced to ash and memory? Even Neptune, who had remained apart from the main gathering, his form tempted by shifting waters, turned toward Saturn, his voice the roar of distant waves. Your unity comes too late, Saturn. Where was this call to arms when the things rose from the depths, the fury unchecked? Where was your strength when Nyarlathotep's shadow first crept out of the realms? You seek to lead us now, but you do so as a conqueror, not as a savior. Slowly, deliberately, Saturn rose from the void throne, his towering presence blotting out the faint luminescence of the chamber. You cling to your pride and doubts, he said. You speak of freedoms, trust of salvation, but the tide of chaos will not wait for your deliberations. Nyarlathotep's scheming will not pause for your fragile egos. I do not ask for loyalty. It's a demand to action. His words silenced the room, their finality leaving no space for dissent. One by one, they began to disperse, departing the Saturnum Regna, their unity fragile, their resolve untested. Saturn, his gaze fixed on the now empty chamber, remained motionless, his thoughts inscrutable as he prepared for the battles to come. And so the assembly ended. Its echoes lingered in the void, a harbinger of the fragile alliance that would shape the fate of the Dreamlands. And I think maybe that's a good place to leave things. So yeah, guys, I hope this was kind of interesting. A little tour of some of the things at work in the newest volume. A little bit of a Lacanian look on things. A little look at that. I guess I did want to talk about the foreclosure of the father. Maybe we can do that next time, because there is kind of like the successions of generation. I think something that's going on in this book as well. Go check out our bookstore link below. You can also check out our Patreon. If you guys like what we're doing here, leave a comment below, like and subscribe. Hope everyone's doing well, and I will see you in the next podcast. I'll be chatting with the people who are posting down below, and looking forward to talking to everyone soon. Take care. Bye-bye.